Chapter 5. Political Structures. My notes. If we want to consider how actors will interact, we must look at the system within which they interact. This isn't a new concept. Economists look at structural constraints, e.g. capitalism versus socialism. I guess, political scientists argue that presidents will behave differently from prime ministers, and so on. Waltz begins by looking at domestic political structures and sees three important characteristics: the principle by which the system is ordered, what form of hierarchical structure is in place, the functions that each unit fulfills, presidential versus parliamentary, etc., and each unit's ability to act. By analogy, Waltz extends these three principles to the international system. The ordering principle is anarchy. If this changed, inter-unit interactions would also change. In anarchy, different units exist in a self-help system. There is therefore no functional differentiation among them. So the two relevant characteristics of the international system are anarchy and relative capacity, power. By analogy, Waltz argues that microeconomic thinking should explain how states will act. States in the international system are like firms in a domestic economy. Every state has the same fundamental interest: to survive. Even if it wants to do other things, it can't do them unless it survives. But are there higher needs? How do you explain what a state will do if its survival isn't threatened? Can you use this model to explain trade, or environmental treaties, and so on? Waltz argues that states are the only important actors in this model. He recognizes that other actors exist, but says they don't matter. He uses an economic analogy to justify this. If all firms are equally sized, they all matter. If the market is dominated by a few large firms, however, then economic models need focus on these. Similarly, since states are the large firms, models can disregard the insignificant, small firms, NGOs, egos, etc. Extending this analogy means we should focus especially on more powerful states. From handout, a structure is defined first by the principle by which it is ordered or organized, then by the differentiation and specification of its units, and finally by the distribution of capabilities across units. For Waltz, anarchy, or the absence of central authority, is the ordering principle of the international system. By analogy to microeconomic theory, Waltz argues that international systems emerge from the collection of self-regarding units. p. 91. In a microtheory, whether economic or political, the motivation of actors is assumed rather than realistically described. Waltz assumes that states seek to ensure their survival. The real aims of states may be endlessly variable, but in a world without security, survival is the essential prerequisite and thus a useful foundation for the theory. Internationally, the environment of states' action, or the structure of their system, is set by the fact that some states prefer survival or other ends obtainable in the short run and act with relative efficiency to achieve that end. p. 93. The second aspect of structure, the differentiation of units, is rendered unnecessary by the condition of anarchy. Anarchy entails relations of coordination among a system's units, and that implies their sameness. So long as anarchy endures, states remain like units. p. 93, which is to say they are autonomous political units. p. 95, who face similar tasks. While Waltz recognizes the existence of non-state actors, he dismisses their importance because states are still the most powerful actors on the world state. They have the most influence and they set the rules. Thus, the international system is defined in terms of states. Students of international politics make distinctions between international political systems only according to the number of their great powers. The structure of a system changes with changes in the distribution of capabilities across a system's units. p. 97. Although this may seem to violate the notion that structure must be defined independently of the attributes of units, Waltz argues that, although capabilities are attributes of units, the distribution of capabilities across units is not. p. 98. The key result from this approach is a positional picture that describes a system in terms of the placement of units rather than in terms of their qualities. p. 99. We learned in chapters 2, 3, and 4 that international political outcomes can't be explained reductively. We found in chapter 3 that even avowedly systemic approaches mingle and confuse systems level with unit level causes. Reflect 1G on theories that follow the general systems model. We concluded that once that international politics does not fit the model closely enough to make the model useful, and that only through some sort of systems theory can international politics be understood. To be a success, such a theory has to show how international politics can be conceived of as a domain distinct from the economic, social, and other international domains that one may conceive of. To mark international political systems off from other international systems, and to distinguish systems level from unit level forces, requires showing how political structures are generated and how they affect, and are affected by, the units of the system. How can we conceive of international politics as a distinct system? 1. What is it that intervenes between interacting units and the results that their acts and interactions are ODUCE? 1. To answer these questions, this chapter first examines the concept of social structure and then defines structure as a concept appropriate for national and for international politics. A system is composed of a structure and of interacting units. The structure is the system-wide component that makes it possible to think of the system as a whole. The problem, unsolved by the systems theorists considered in chapter is to contrive a definition of structure freed of the attributes and the interactions of units. Definitions of structure must leave aside, or abstract from, the characteristics of units, their behavior, and their interactions. Why must those obviously important matters be omitted? 1. They must be omitted so that we can distinguish between variables at the level of the units and variables at the level of the system. Notes: Kenneth N. Waltz, Theory of International Politics. Reading, M.A. Addison Wesley, 1979. Chapter 5, Political Structures. The best way to overcome the limitations of reductionist and avowedly systemic approaches is to have a structural approach to a theory that explains international politics. The problem of systems theory: to contrive a definition of structure free of the attributes and interactions of the units. Structural theories must leave aside, or abstract from, the characteristics of units, their behavior, and their interactions. 79. Instead of focusing on how units interact, a structure must focus on how units are arranged or positioned. These are the 3 keys way to think about structure. 82. Ordering principle. This is the principle by which the units are arranged, their relationship. Functional specification. What the different units do, a division of labor, if you will. Distribution of capabilities across units. Ordering principles. 88-93. In domestic society, the ordering principes are hierarchic, but international systems are decentralized and anarchic. The use of microeconomic theory explains how anarchy can still be used as an organizational concept. Classic microeconomic theory is a microtheory. The theory is constructed from the activities of the separate units. Individual firms act self-interestedly. From the cohesion of like units, a structure, a market emerges. Similar in international politics, structures emerge from the coexistence of states. No state intends to participate in the formation of a structure by which it and others will be constrained. International political systems, like economic markets, are individualist in origin, spontaneously generated, and unintended. In both systems, structures are formed by the action of their units. Whether those units live, prosper, or die depends on their own efforts. Both systems are formed and maintained on a principle of self-help that applies to the units. 91. The self-help principle behind anarchy is an assumption on Waltz's part. I assume that states seek to ensure their survival. 91. Since survival is a prerequisite to any other of the varied ends of state, this is a fair assumption in a world where the security of states is not assured. Character of units, 93-97. In domestic society, units are functionally differentiated because they are in a hierarchic realm. In international political systems, units are not formally differentiated, 93. So, this principle of structure drops out. Under anarchy, states remain like units. States are alike in the tasks they face. Functionally, they all must do the same thing. International politics consists of like units duplicating one another's activities. 97. Distribution of capabilities, 97-100. Units are distinguished primarily by their greater or lesser capabilities for performing similar tasks, 97. What counts? Great powers. Power is estimated by comparing the capabilities of a number of units. 98. Again, the microeconomics analogy. Market structure is defined by counting firms. International political structure, by counting states. In counting, distinctions are made only according to capabilities. Thus, we can call a structure unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, etc. Kenneth Waltz examines the concept of social structures and defines structure as a concept appropriate for national and international politics. A system, composed of a structure and of interacting units. The structure is the system-wide component that makes it possible to think of the system as a whole. A structure requires ignoring how unites relate with one another, the interaction, and concentrating on how they stand in relation to one another. Interactions take place at the level of units. A structure is defined by the arrangement of parts greater than only changes of arrangement are structural changes. The constitution of a state describes some part of the arrangement, but political structures as they develop are not identical with formed institutions. Domestic politics, hierarchically ordered. Political structures shape political processes, i.e. different governmental principles. 1. Ordering principles. International systems are decentralized and anarchic in the absence of agents with system-wide authority. Formal relations of super and subordination fail to develop. 2. Internationally, the environment of states' action of the structures of their system is set by the fact that some states prefer survival over the other ends obtainable. 3. The distribution of capabilities. The structure of a system changes with changes in the distribution of capabilities across the system's units. And changes in structure changes expectations about how the units of the system will behave and about the outcomes their interactions will produce. Chapter 6, from handout. Anarchy does not imply that violence is common in the international system, but rather that the threat of violence is ever present. Anarchy means that the international system is one of self-help. Waltz identifies two ways in which the structure of the international system limits cooperation. First, the condition of insecurity, at the least, the uncertainty of each about the other's future intentions and actions, works against their cooperation. A state worries about the division of possible gains that may favor other more than itself. Pages 105-6. Second, a state also worries lest it become dependent on others through trade and/or cooperation, and therefore also chooses to limit its cooperation with other states. p. 106. States do not willingly place themselves in situations of increased independence. In a self-help system, considerations of security subordinate economic gain to political interest. p. 107. The structure of the system forces states into this kind of behavior. The only way out is structural change. Nevertheless, Waltz sees virtues in anarchy, principally that the high costs of organization in a hierarchic order are avoided and that states can preserve their autonomy. Balance of power theory, pages 116-128 in Chapter 6. Still from handout. 1. States are unitary actors who seek, at a minimum, their own preservation and, at a maximum, universal domination. 2. States seek to achieve their goals either through internal balancing, increasing economic and military strength, or external balancing, creating alliances. 3. For this theory to operate, we must see two or more states in a self-help system with no superior authority over them. In seeking to test his theory, Waltz arguing that confirming cases, as opposed to just falsifiable cases, are acceptable, particularly if hard cases, those where you would not expect the theory to hold, are chosen. He also suggests that one should infer empirically verifiable predictions. However, he concedes that balance of power theory's predictions are indeterminate. It posits only a loose condition of balance, and thus it is unclear when that condition does not hold. Also, internal conditions may preclude states from balancing consistently. See balancing behavior, even in cases where one would not ordinarily expect. He points to the French-Russian alliance of 1894 or the US and Soviet decisions to rearm after WWII. Finally, Waltz contrasts balancing with bandwagoning, in which weaker states choose to ally with the stronger state. Waltz argues that, because power is a means not an end, states prefer to join the weaker of two coalitions. p. 126. Again, the structure of the international system and the necessity of survival dictate this behavior. Waltz, 1979, 117 insists that if there is any distinctively political theory of international politics, balance of power is it. And in Theory of International Politics, he attempts to formulate and clarify the basis for such a theory. He recognizes, of course, that there is no agreed statement of the theory, and that even the meaning of the balance of power is the source of endless disagreement. As a consequence, he ponders whether it is not quixotic to attempt to cut through the confusion that surrounds the idea. Nevertheless, this is the aim that he sets himself, and in attempting to establish a model of the balance of power, he produced one of the most widely cited and controversial books in the field. Although, on the face of it, much of the book is not directly concerned with the balance of power, its entire contents are designed, in practice, to establish what constitute the necessary conditions for a successful theory of international politics and to explain why the balance of power provides the most effective candidate for developing such a theory. The main aim of this chapter is to explicate the essential features of Waltz's model of the balance of power, but in the process, two incidental but significant insights that run directly counter to conventional assessments of theory of international politics also and somewhat unexpectedly emerge. Two tasks remain: first, to examine the characteristics of anarchy and the expectations about outcomes associated with anarchic realms. Second, to examine the ways in which expectations vary as the structure of an anarchic system changes through changes in the distribution of capabilities across nations. The second task, undertaken in chapters 7, 8, and 9, requires comparing different international systems. The first, which I now turn to, is best accomplished by drawing some comparisons between behavior and outcomes in anarchic and hierarchic realms. 1. Violence at home and abroad. The state among states, it is often said, conducts its affairs in the brooding shadow of violence. Because some states may at any time use force, all states must be prepared to do so or lie at the mercy of their militarily more vigorous neighbors. Among states, the state of nature is a state of war. This is meant not in the sense that war constantly occurs, but in the sense that, with each state deciding for itself whether or not to use force, war may at any time break out. Whether in the family, the community, or the world at large, contact without at least occasional conflict is inconceivable, and the hope that in the absence of an agent to manage or to manipulate conflicting parties, the use of force will always be avoided cannot be realistically entertained. Among men as among states, anarchy, or the absence of government, is associated with the occurrence of violence. The threat of violence and the recurrent use of force are said to distinguish international from national affairs. But in the history of the world, surely most rulers have had to bear in mind that their subjects might use force to resist or anarchic orders and balances of power. Overthrow them. If the absence of government is associated with the threat of violence, so also is its presence. A haphazard list of national tragedies illustrates the point all too well. The most destructive wars of the 100 years following the defeat of Napoleon took place not among states but within them. Estimates of deaths in China's Taiping Rebellion, which began in 1851 and lasted 13 years, range as high as 20 million. In the American Civil War, some 600,000 people lost their lives. In more recent history, forced collectivization and Stalin's purges eliminated 5 million Russians, and Hitler exterminated 6 million Jews. In some Latin American countries, coups d'états and rebellions have been normal features of national life. Between 1948 and 1957, for example, 200,000 Colombians were killed in civil strife. In the middle 19,705, most inhabitants of Idi Amin's Uganda must have felt their lives becoming nasty, brutish, and short, quite as in Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature. If such cases constitute aberrations, they are uncomfortably common ones. We easily lose sight of the fact that struggles to achieve and maintain power, to establish order, and to contrive a kind of justice within states, may be bloodier than wars among them. If anarchy is identified with chaos, destruction, and death, then the distinction between anarchy and government does not tell us much. Which is more precarious? The life of a state among states, or of a government in relation to its subjects? The answer varies with time and place. Among some states at some times, the actual or expected occurrence of violence is low. Within some states at some times, the actual or expected occurrence of violence is high. The use of force, or the constant fear of its use, are not sufficient grounds for distinguishing international from domestic affairs. If the possible and the actual use of force mark both national and international orders, then no durable distinction between the two realms can be drawn in terms of the use or the non-use of force. No human order is proof against violence. To discover qualitative differences between internal and external affairs, one must look for a criterion other than the occurrence of violence. The distinction between international and national realms of politics is not found in the use or the non-use of force but in their different structures. But if the dangers of being violently attacked are greater, say, in taking an evening stroll through downtown Detroit than they are in picnicking along the French and German border, what practical difference does the difference of structure make? Nationally as internationally, contact generates conflict and at times issues in violence. The difference between national and international politics lies not in the use of force but in the different modes of organization for doing something about it. A government, ruling by some standard of legitimacy, arrogates to itself the right to use force, that is, to apply a variety of sanctions to control the use of force by its subjects. If some use private force, others may appeal to the government. A government has no monopoly on the use of force, as is all too evident. An effect. Chapter 6. Tude was well expressed by Trotsky, who, when asked what he would do as foreign minister, replied, "I will issue some revolutionary proclamations to the peoples and then close up the joint," quoted in Von Lau 1963, p. 235. In a competitive arena, however, one party may need the assistance of others. Refusal to play the political game may risk one's own destruction. The pressures of competition were rapidly felt and reflected in the Soviet Union's diplomacy. Thus Lenin, sending Foreign Minister Keohane to the Genoa Conference of 1922, bade him farewell with this caution: "Avoid big words," quoted in More 1950, p. 204. Keohane, who personified the carefully tailored traditional diplomat rather than the simply uniformed revolutionary, was to refrain from inflammatory rhetoric for the sake of working deals. These he successfully completed with that other pariah power and ideological enemy, Germany. The close juxtaposition of states promotes their sameness through the disadvantages that arise from a failure to conform to successful practices. It is this sameness, an effect of the system, that is so often attributed to the acceptance of so-called rules of state behavior. Chiliastic rulers occasionally come to power. In power, most of them quickly change their ways. They can refuse to do so, and yet hope to survive, only if they rule countries little affected by the competition of states. The socialization of nonconformist states proceeds at a pace that is set by the extent of their involvement in the system. And that is another testable statement. The theory leads to many expectations about behaviors and outcomes. From the theory, one predicts that states will engage in balancing behavior, whether or not balanced power is the end of their acts. From the theory, one predicts a strong tendency toward balance in the system. The expectation is not that balance, once achieved, will be maintained, but that a balance, once disrupted, will be restored in one way or another. Balances of power recurrently form. Since the theory depicts international politics as a competitive system, one predicts more specifically that states will display characteristics common to competitors, namely, that they will imitate each other and become socialized to their system. In this chapter, I have suggested ways of making these propositions more specific and concrete so as to test them. In remaining chapters, as the theory is elaborated and refined, additional testable propositions will appear. 7 Structural Causes and Econodal Effects. Chapter 6 compared national and international systems and showed how behavior and outcomes vary from one system to another. Chapter 7, 8, and 9 compare different international systems and show how behavior and outcomes vary in systems whose ordering principles endure but whose structures vary through changes in the distribution of capabilities across states. The question posed in this chapter is whether we should prefer larger or smaller numbers of great powers. Part 1 carries the theory further. Part 2 moves from theory to practice. Asterisk. I1. Counting poles and measuring power. How should we count poles, and how can we measure power? These questions must be answered in order to identify variations of structure. Almost everyone agrees that at some time since the war the world was bipolar. Few seem to believe that it remains so. For years Walter Lippmann wrote of the bipolar world as being perpetually in the process of rapidly passing away, e.g., 1950 and 1963. Many others now carry on the tradition he so firmly established. To reach the conclusion that bipolarity is passing, or past, requires some odd counting. The inclination to count in funny ways is rooted in the desire to arrive at a particular answer. Scholars feel a strong affection for the balance of power world of Metternich and Bismarck, on which many of their theoretical notions rest. That was a world in which 5 or so great powers manipulated their neighbors and maneuvered for advantage. Great powers were once defined according to their capabilities. Students of international politics now seem to look at other conditions. The ability or inability of states to solve problems is said to raise or lower their rankings. The asterisk. Some parts of this chapter and the next one were written as a study of interdependence for the Department of State, whose views may differ from mine. Reason of state. These are the grouping of insights into how leaders should act in international politics. It dictates what leaders should do in order to maintain a state's A. Health B. Strength C. Well-being even when in threatening situations. Dual moral standards. Reason of state's proponents also like this one. This dictates that a state person should have 2 different sets of moral standards, in which one A is for individual citizens of the state, B is for how the state interacts with other states. Political community. Many have called realist immoral, but realists argue that the existence of a state is necessary for an ethical political community to be. History of Peloponnesian War. Written by Thucydides. International politics is dictated by humans' continuous struggle for power, which is based on their nature. There is no place where they are circumscribed for A. Justice B. Law C. Society. His book, very important, has formed the basis of realism. Historian of the Peloponnesian War, which was between A. Sparta B. Keohane. He demonstrated that power politics is a law of human behavior. He argued that the fundamental aspects of power politics include A. Desire for power, B. Self-interest. The power politics between states is a copy of human nature. National interest. This is the interest of the state. According to Thucydides, it served as the basis of states' action in world politics. It is based on survival. Statism. This is the ideal that the state is the legitimate representation of the collective will of the people. Legitimacy allows it to use its authority within the state. Survival. This is the basis that all states' interests are to survive. Basis of realism. Self-help. States have to help themselves in the international order. Each state must ensure its own survival. Realists do not believe it to be wise for another state to leave its safety survival to another state. In order to ensure its own survival, or if it feels threatened, increasing its military capabilities is one way to do this. However, sometimes this is not an available option, and so another one is taken, which includes A. Preventative wars, B. Military alliances. The Prince. Written by Machiavelli. Political realism that recognized that the principles have to be subordinated to policies. The best political leaders are those that can adapt to changes in the political power configurations within and world politics. He stated that men are naturally bad and that politicians should act according to how politics really is instead of how they wish it to be. The necessity of a state to survive no matter the cost derives from human nature. Leviathan. Written Hobbes. Humans are naturally in a constant search for power. Life in the state of nature is the same as in the international system. He writes that all men have an unlimited desire for power that only ends in death. Man and nature are equal, which makes competition for power intensify as the weakest can kill the strongest. With no higher authority, state of nature is one in which every man must defend for himself. He argues that the state of nature is similar to one of war in which independent states compete with each other. Power. Extremely important to realism. Usually defined in realism as militarily strategic. The state of war. Rousseau. He argues that it is the system of international politics that creates A. Fear B. Jealousy C. Suspicion D. Insecurity. Rousseau took the study of human nature done by Hobbes and elaborated it. He disagreed with Hobbes' view of human nature. He focused more on the social contract made that led to the creation of sovereignty. He believed that this contract represented the collective will of the people. Social contract solves domestic problems but does not solve international relations. Peace of Westphalia. Since this, the sovereign state equals most important actor. Classical realism 20th century. Key thinkers include Morgenthau and his book, Politics Among Nations. Politics is governed by laws created by human nature. The mechanism we use to understand intel politics is the concept of interests, defined in terms of power. Morgenthau stated that intel politics, like all politics, equals struggle for power. He agreed that human nature emulates the world order and that humans are naturally desiring power. Goal of every state equals max power. He described three forms of power, which include A. Status quo, B. Prestige, C. Imperialism. It was important for Morgenthau other theorists that the interests that a state pursued matched their power. A. Status quo. This is when a state maintains power. B. Prestige. This is when a state demonstrates power. C. Imperialism. This is when a country wants to increase power. Balance of power. Margaret Hahn knew that the constraints for the struggle of power were not very strong in the national field but very strong in the international field. Realists throughout the ages deemed this the best way to maintain liberty for states. Definitions vary, but a basic one is that if a hegemonic power or a powerful alliance start to form, states should align together in order to check the alliance's state's rising power. Structural realism, neorealism. Key thinkers include A. Waltz and his book, Theory of International Politics. B. Mearsheimer and his book, Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Anarchy results to the logic that states have to seek self-help in order to secure their security. Balances of power will always reoccur. Waltz said that intel politics equals struggle for power, but that it did not originate from human nature. Waltz, others of this theory, argued that the structure of intel politics was the reason for A. Security competition. B. Inter-state conflict. C. Difficulties of achieving international cooperation. They blamed the absence of authority, that there is no higher than states to establish authority. Structural realists structure the international system in three elements which include A. Organizing principles. B. Differentiation of units. C. Distribution of capabilities. They try to rank states in how powerful they are based on the distribution of capabilities, in order to determine the current power structure. Waltz also believes that balances of power reoccur. A. Organizing principles. This involves two principles which are, according to Waltz, A. Anarchy, decentralized element of international politics. B. Hierarchy, basis for domestic order. B. Differentiation of units. Waltz argues that the unit-level differences, which are states, are minor and do not matter. As such, it does not matter if a state is democratic or authoritarian. C. Distribution of capabilities. This is the most important element to determining the results of situations in international politics. This is the key independent variable in understanding the reasons behind A. War peace. B. Balance of power. C. Alliance politics. Through this, structural realists are able to rank states in the order of how powerful they are. The number of powerful states in the international order determines the structure of the international system. This affects how a state behaves because great powers have to be worried about rising powers in order to maintain their security. Neoclassical realism. Key thinkers include Zakaria and his book, From Wealth to Power. Structural realism does not give a complete systemic account of world politics. Structural realism needs to be supported with studies of unit-level variables such as A. How is power perceived? B. How leadership is exercised. Offensive realism. This is Mearsheimer's theory. Variant of structural realism. It has many similarities in its assumptions with realist. However, differs in describing the behavior of states. States are power maximizers in that states know that the best way to survive equals be the most powerful state. Self-help equals underlying reason for state actions. However, because states never know what the intentions of the other state are, states continuously search for power at the expense of others. He argues that the ideal international system, which he argues can never be realized, is one in which there is a hegemony. Realism definition. No. The theoretical approach that analyzes all international relations as the relation of states engaged in the pursuit of power. Realism cannot accommodate non-state actors within its analysis. What does realism focus on? O. Focus on thesis rather than ignored. The role of power, important to maximize the interest of the state. Focused on interests, instead of on ideology, to seek peace through strength, and to recognize that great powers can coexist even if they have antithetical values and beliefs. Who is key actors in realism? O. The state. O. People. Thucydides, Niccolò Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes. How is power defined for realists? O. Realists pursue power. Power guarantees your survival. Power is defined as narrowly in military strategic terms. What does a state should do when it feels threatened? O. Use of force in war is legitimate. Seek to augment its own power by increasing its military capabilities. What are the three forms of realism? O. Statism, survival, self-help. Classical. Structural. Neoclassical. Define the three core of realism: statism, survival and self-help. O. Statism. Realism identifies the group of the fundamental unit of political analysis. The basic unit was the polis or city-state. It's a term given to the idea of the state, the legitimate representative of the collective will of the people. O. Legitimacy enables the state to exercise its authority outside of your own. Waltz's theory of defensive realism. O. A structural theory of realism that views states as security maximizers. O. Waltz argues that power maximization often proves to be suboptimal because it triggers a counterbalancing coalition of states. Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism. O. It argues that states are power maximizers. O. The structure of the international system compels states to maximize their relative power position. O. Argues all states are continuously searching for opportunities to gain power at the expense of other states. Ferid Zakaria's state-centered realism. O. He argues that the president and his administration tried to increase the country's political influence abroad when they saw an increase in the nation's relative economic power, but they frequently had to curtail their plans for expansion, he shows, because they lacked a strong central government that could harness that economic power for the purposes of foreign policy. What is security dilemma? O. When the military preparations of one state create an unresolvable uncertainty in the mind of another as to whether those preparations are for defensive purposes in their benefit. Statism. O. Realism identifies the group as the fundamental unit of political analysis. During Thucydides and Machiavelli's era, the basic unit was the polis or city-state. O. Since the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, realists consider the sovereign state as the principal actor in international politics. This is often referred as the state-centric assumption of realism. O. Statism is a term given to the idea of the state as the legitimate representative of the collective will of the people. O. Legitimacy enables the state to exercise its authority within its domestic borders. Outside the borders, realists argue anarchy exists, meaning there is a lack of central authority. O. Morgenthau argues that international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. Survival. O. For realists, the priority for state leaders is to ensure the survival of the state. O. Realists assume that states with more power stand a better chance of surviving than states with less power. O. Power is crucial for realists. It is defined through the military. O. Irrespective of how much power a state has, the core national interests of all states must be survival. Self-help. O. Self-help is the principle of action in an anarchical system where there is no global government. Each state is responsible for ensuring its own well-being and survival.